Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. The years after the expulsion of the Decemvirate were hard. Old problems remained unsolved, while new ones threatened to tear the city apart. Patrician and plebe were at each other's throats over wealth, power, and land. The population of the city was growing, and there was not enough land to give them, and not enough food to feed them. Crop failures exacerbated the problem, and famine became a persistent killer. Bitter tensions led to a breakdown of military resolve, and old enemies long contained now returned a match for their former betters. The Volscians and Aequians both peeled off Roman territory to the east and south, and there was little the legions could do about it. This is how the Romans limped through the second half of the 400s BC, hungry, tired, weak, and demoralized. At the turn of the century, a final victory over Veii would lift the hopes, albeit briefly, of the city, but for now, life was a dreary war of attrition. In the aftermath of the publication of the 12 Tables, the plebes immediately became aware of an institutionalized bias against them. They were incensed to see a codification of the ban against patrician-plebe marriage and immediately opened a new front in their war for equality. The issue of greatest concern was access to the high offices of state. This meant the consulship and the religious offices of Pontifex Maximus and its subordinate priesthoods. Only patricians by law could hold these offices, and if plebes could not intermarry with patricians, then they would never gain access to the highest positions of authority or have the final say in law and religion. The plebes attacked this imbalance from two angles. First, they sought to legalize patrician-plebe intermarriage, and second, they demanded that the consulship be open to plebe candidates. The former would be won quickly, and as to the latter, it would be just under 100 years before the first plebe was finally named consul in 366 BC. In 445, a tribune named Canuleius introduced a bill legalizing patrician-plebe marriage. The measure was fought by the patricians, who fretted about the dilution of pure patrician blood, but their resistance was only half-hearted. For one thing, their arguments really had no leg to stand on. When it came to officiating the necessary religious sacrifices, the Romans, all of them, believed that a patrician must be the official in charge, or the gods would be offended. Some patrician families claimed that mixing the two classes would inevitably offend the gods, but in Roman law, legal status followed the father's position alone, without any concept of genetic makeup. Incest, for example, did not even cover relations between maternal cousins. They were simply not considered part of the same family. So claims about blood dilution came off as absurd. Any child born to a patrician father was a patrician, period. Flimsy racial arguments aside, the matter basically came down to not wanting to share with the other children, and patrician solidarity soon cracked. There were a number of noble families who eyed the fortunes of the wealthy plebe families, and the measure was soon passed. As to admission into the consulship, the patricians fought much harder to prevent it, and far dirtier. This was not a toy that they were going to share with the other children. And so in 444 BC, right on the heels of plebes gaining at least nominal access to power, the consulship was suspended and the third manifestation of executive power was inaugurated: military tribunes with consular power. The switch was not permanent, though, and for the next 80-odd years the executive leadership of Rome alternated between the new military tribunes and the traditional dual consulship, depending on the circumstances of a given year. Initially, 3 military tribunes would be elected by the centuriata and granted executive authority over the state, though over the years that number rose to 4 and then to 6. The introduction of the new executive form can be seen as a move by the patricians to protect the consulship from plebe taint. No plebe could be consul if no consuls were elected. The military tribunes were elected democratically by the army, and plebes as well as patricians stood for and won election. This was fine with the patricians as long as the sanctity of the consulship itself was guarded. Further, by increasing the number of executives, plebe ambition was mollified, and at the same time power was watered down so that the elected plebes were not as singularly powerful as they would be if they had been consuls. Plus, the entire exercise kept plebes from agitating too hard for admission to the consulship. For the years between 444 and 367 BC, military tribunes were elected roughly half the time, the other years being governed by the traditional dual consuls. Much has gone into analyzing what factors determined whether consuls or tribunes would be elected for a given year, but by cross-referencing executive form with military activity, a possible answer emerges. Consuls were generally in charge during the major conflicts of the era, so it would seem that military tribunes were elected when no major military action was planned, whereas consuls were elected when engagement was imminent. This seems counterintuitive given the name military tribune, but it makes sense. Plebes with consular power were acceptable to the patricians as long as they were destined for little more than off-year administrative duties. When real action was required, the patrician-controlled consulship was returned. The patricians wanted to make sure that they alone determined the course of state in times of crisis. If this is true, then the creation of military tribunes with consular power was little more than a stall tactic formulated by the patricians to put off full political equality with the plebes, which it did for the better part of 80 years. A second action by the patricians further removed the plebes from access to real power. One of the most important duties of the consuls was administering the census once every 5 years. The census determined citizen status as well as classification within the five-tiered system of the commita centuriata. The consuls charged with taking the census had enormous latitude at the edges of the dividing lines to move citizens up or down, granting a degree of control over the end voting blocks of the centuriata. More than that even, it was during the census that citizen status was granted or revoked. Obviously, the patricians had a keen interest in maintaining control of the census, and when military tribunes were introduced, the administration of the census was peeled off from the other consular powers and invested into a new office that was destined to become one of the most coveted of all the magistracies, the censor. In time, the censor would acquire other duties, most famously the vague directive to protect public morals, but for now the single role of administering the census was important enough. By senatorial decree, the censor had to be a patrician, ostensibly because of the religious ceremonies of the census that needed attending to, but most likely it was to make sure that plebes could never engineer more favorable voting blocks for themselves in the centuriata. These political reforms closed out the cycle initiated by Terentulus in 462 BC when he first proposed the creation of the 12 table. The political and economic structure of Rome would not see significant alteration until the opening of the Samnite Wars in the mid-300s BC, not for lack of plebe agitation, but because the patricians seemed to have closed ranks and resisted any further reforms. As I said at the beginning, the years ahead were long and hard for Rome. Grain shortages were reported in a dozen of the next 50 years, with devastating famines following. The lack of nourishment inevitably led to plagues, which further decimated the population. Rome was forced to seek help from surrounding communities, north in Etruria and south in Magna Graecia and Sicily. Their requests, though, were denied as often as they were approved, and many of their neighbors reveled in Rome's misery after so many years of dominance. Just about every one of their enemies took advantage of Rome's depleted and malnourished army, and Rome's sphere of influence gradually began to erode. The Volscians and Aequians, once easily dispatched, now let their flocks graze in Roman fields uncontested. In the midst of this desperation, some men allowed their scruples to take a backseat to ambition, and one man in particular would pay the ultimate price for his hubris. A wealthy merchant named Manlius, who had never served in any important office but was of equestrian rank, began to dream bigger than his prudence should have allowed. In 439 BC, during a typical grain famine, official Roman envoys in Etruria rejected the Etruscan price for grain as gouging and returned to the city empty-handed. Manlius then went himself and agreed to pay the exorbitant cost, bringing home the grain the people needed and handing it out for free. Manlius was an overnight sensation, a newly minted political rock star. Everywhere he went, he was greeted by large ovations acclaiming his generosity. Manlius looked at the adoring masses and at his own personal fortune and let his imagination get away from him. He moved quickly from dream to action and began to actively conspire against the state with the intention of making himself king. The Republican government, he rationalized, had failed to protect and feed the people where he, Manlius, had succeeded. It was only right that he should rule. He began cashing weapons and bribing the plebe leadership to rise with him when he made his move against the Senate, but alas, it was not to be. The state controller of supplies, a man named Minucius, dealt daily with the same grain merchants who dealt with Manlius and soon learned about the plot. He went straight away to the Senate, who flew into a panic, recognizing their own unpopularity, coupled with the people's desperate state, might be enough to slip tyranny in the back door. The Senate needed a man whose fame and popularity outshone that of Manlius's to put a stop to the conspiracy. As I mentioned last week, they went back to Cincinnatus, now well over 80, and appointed him dictator once again. All of Manlius's careful planning was undone in a moment. Cincinnatus sent his master of horse to fetch Manlius and bring him forward for a trial. Manlius, knowing that he was in deep trouble, attempted to resist the summons, and when he did, the master of horse cut him down where he stood. There was a brief popular uproar over the murder, but Cincinnatus legitimized the act, saying that Manlius was being summoned merely for trial, and that it was his refusal to appear, not his alleged criminal activity, that sealed his fate. Political order was restored and Cincinnatus again resigned. Soon after the death of Manlius, an external threat emerged that would eventually lead Rome into its final definitive clash with Veii. The city of Fidenae, an Etruscan outpost on the Roman side of the Tiber, which had been under Roman control for some time, decided to revolt and called for Veii's help. They figured that Rome, weak internally and caught up in the south with intrusive tribes, would be forced to let the city go, but Rome was determined to maintain control. Hostilities began with Fidenae, hoping to goad Rome into a battle she would lose, murdered 4 visiting Roman envoys. This treacherous act did lead to an immediate Roman response, but no conclusive action was achieved on either side. The war with Veii-backed Fidenae dragged on for years. To the Romans, victory was a necessity. If they lost control of Fidenae, trade up the Tiber River would be severely hampered, but despite the Romans' best efforts, Fidenae held out, and trade suffered accordingly. Through the 430s and 420s BC, Rome found itself militarily engaged on 3 fronts, in the north, east, and south, economically isolated and politically divided. It was not a good time to be a Roman. Some relief came around 425 BC, when the Romans finally won back control over Fidenae, but Veii itself still loomed on the horizon. The Romans, for the moment, dreaded a fight with their rival, and did not follow up their recovery of Fidenae with action into Veii territory. A confrontation was brewing between the two powers. Their political and economic destinies were on a collision course, but for now a tense truce prevailed. Veii seemed to have been dealing with its own internal problems at the time, and so did not strike when the iron was hot, immediately at the end of a war which had drained Rome physically and emotionally. This gave the Romans a chance to catch their breath and consolidate their power. When the final clash with Veii finally erupted, the Romans were in a position to challenge their Etruscan rival on equal footing. The years leading up to the war with Veii were hard, but these decades would highlight the characteristic Roman obstinance that would win them an empire. The Romans simply did not give up. Beaten, harassed, tired, and divided, the Romans soldiered on. The Roman unwillingness to quit in the face of adversity bordered on the edge of insanity. They would accept catastrophic losses but would never surrender. In the centuries that followed, Rome was many times beaten so badly that they should have relinquished their dreams of empire and retired to the dustbin of history, but instead they buried the dead and raised a fresh army, never suing for peace and never retreating. It was this unwavering advance that so frightened Rome's enemies. In battle, legionaries would fall, but the line would keep marching incessantly forward, dispassionate, calm, and mechanical. There was no psyching out the legions or driving them to flight. They just kept coming. And if you decisively beat one Roman army, rather than surrendering like a civilized nation, the Romans raised another and set it against you, until more from exhaustion than anything else you were beaten and inexplicably found yourself under the yoke of a foe you thought you had beaten. This was the Roman way, and during these hard years it was on full display. It has often been said that of some generations much is asked, and of others much is given. Of this generation much was asked, and without even the promise of glory to soothe them. Their fights were not the great wars that made men famous. They were forced to deal with persistent skirmishes of attrition which cost lives and profited no one. The Romans of the Middle Imperium, which Gibbon famously called the safest, most civilized, and most comfortable generation in history, bears no resemblance to the thin, desperate Romans of the late 400s BC, but that future was secured by the sacrifice of these early suffering generations, of whom much was asked and nothing was given. I'll close tonight with a rare programming note. I am going on vacation, so there will be no new episode next week. But fear not, we will return in 2 weeks and trace the final conflict with Veii, Rome's very own Trojan War, complete with victory secured by sneak attack, and introduce a giant of the early republic, Marcus Furius Camillus, known as the second founder of Rome. Until then, I want to thank all of you who have subscribed and supported the history of Rome since it began. It has been an immensely gratifying experience, and all of you out there listening have made it possible. Thank you, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Last time, we left Rome on an upbeat. Fidenae recovered, and their position in the region stabilized. The Volscians were still a persistent menace to the south, but by this time they were clearly on the decline militarily. In another few decades, Rome would finally put an end to the Volscian threat and conquer them once and for all, but for now periodic clashes continued to be a mainstay of legion activity. The main threat to Rome, though, lay north with the city-state of Veii, long an economic, political, and military rival. When not clashing with Veii directly, the Etruscan city had bankrolled Rome's enemies and fought by proxy. After years of avoiding conflict because they were stretched too thin, the Romans finally felt secure enough to challenge their northern rival openly and committed themselves to a war that would determine who controlled central Italy. As I mentioned earlier, Veii was the southernmost member of the Etruscan League, a loose confederation of 12 city-states that controlled Italy from the Tiber north to the Po Valley. Other members of the League included Tarquini, birthplace of Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome, and Clausium, home of Lars Porsena, who either did or did not conquer Rome. Had there been any solidarity between the cities, it is doubtful Rome would have emerged triumphant from its war with Veii, but the League served an economic and cultural function rather than a political and military one. This failure to unite would ultimately spell the end for the Etruscans, who, in addition to pressure from Rome in the south, suddenly faced the threat of migrating Gauls, who were passing through the Alps into the Po Valley and squeezing the Etruscans out of land in the north. The third prong of the assault that would mark the end of Etruscan power was the ascendancy of Syracuse, the powerful Greek city in Sicily, who bottled up the Carthaginians, long an Etruscan economic and military ally, preventing any outside aid from reaching the besieged Etruscan cities. Syracuse had just put itself on the map by defeating an Athenian invasion force in 413 BC, and now ambitiously sought to control all mainland Italy. But, getting back to the topic at hand, the war between Rome and Veii was inevitable. Veii lay a mere 12 miles north of Rome, far too close for the two powers to coexist peacefully forever. Eventually, economic necessity drove them both to the conclusion that the other had to be eliminated. The region was simply not big enough for the both of them. There were three basic points of economic conflict that could not be resolved peacefully. The first was control of the lucrative salt beds at the mouth of the Tiber. Almost all the inland communities relied on the Tiber beds as their source of salt, and whoever controlled the source controlled a reliable cash cow. But the beds lay mostly on the north bank of the river, and so were controlled by Veii. The Romans looked on with envy and for years sought to dislodge the Veiites, but were never in a position to do so. Now it seemed the time was ripe to make their move. The Romans wanted to control the beds, but Veii was not going to give them up without a fight. The salt trade was so important because of the economic conditions at the time, economic conditions that made the world too small for both powers. After the Etruscans had lost their foothold south of Rome to the Volscians, their direct connection to trade with Magna Graecia was severed. The archaeological record shows that the flood of trade Veii had once enjoyed as the gateway to Etruria now slowed to a trickle. Their overland trade routes closed, the Veiites were forced to rely on seafaring traders, most importantly their Carthaginian allies, but after the rise of Syracuse, those Carthaginian traders began to be squeezed out, and Veii's economy suffered as a result. In better days, northbound trade was ample enough to be split between Veii and Rome, but now the limited supply was not enough to supply two economic centers. One had to be eliminated or both would die. Finally, there was the basic issue of territory. Rome's population was expanding, but its territory was not. Veii controlled huge tracts of fertile land that all levels of Roman society coveted. The richest patrician and the poorest plebeian both saw the land north of the Tiber as the answer to their overpopulation crisis. The patricians wanted the land to relocate the landless plebes, who were agitating with escalating fervor to redistribute patrician land in a more equitable manner, and the plebes just wanted land, whatever the source. The need to control the salt markets, the need to control the sparse overland trade with Magna Graecia, and the need to control the land north of the Tiber finally drove the Romans to action, and around 400 BC it was decided to take Veii out once and for all. The Veiites, equally in a bind, were more than willing to take up the fight, and the final conflict was joined. The war with Veii was unlike any the Romans had undertaken thus far, and the battle would change the nature and character of the Romans forever. Livy dates the conflict as taking place between 402 and 392 BC, and the archaeological record tends to back up this chronology, though not completely. The traditional length given for the war is 10 years, but most historians agree that this number was lifted from the mythical Trojan War, and that the actual conflict more likely lasted 6 or 7 years. Battles in the field were intermittent and inconclusive, leading the Romans to change tactics and besiege Veii itself rather than try and beat its army in the field. This forced the Romans to do something they had never before even contemplated, keeping an army in the field year-round. Traditionally, the campaign season lasted between April and October, with soldiers returning home for the winter. It was completely unprecedented to keep an army enrolled past October, but after the decision was made to lay siege to Veii, this is exactly what happened. The soldiers suffered this outrage only because the Senate introduced an innovation that would mark a turning point in Roman history: soldier pay. It was not a great sum, nor was it a permanent policy, but it set a precedent and marked the first step on the long road toward the establishment of a fully professional army, a road that led directly to the death of the Republic. For now, though, it was an expedient to keep an army in the field at a time when the soldiers had to return home to look after their farms. The pay alleviated the economic burden the soldiers faced and kept them fighting. The siege soon turned into a prolonged siege. The Romans wanted nothing more than a quick, decisive victory, but Veii was situated in a nearly impregnable position. Bounded on 3 sides by cliffs, only a narrow strip of land north of the city offered a level entrance. The Romans managed to gain control of that strip and cut Veii off from the rest of the world, but they were never able to do much more than that. The Veiites were able to concentrate their total defensive capabilities on that one accessible point, and so the Romans were unable to make any headway. Though not far from home, again, Veii was only 12 miles from Rome, the soldiers were forced to remain in camp through the winter and began to grumble at the injustice of remaining in arms. The tribunes railed against the policy, claiming that the siege was a patrician policy dedicated more to getting influential plebes out of the city than actually winning the war. Look at Veii, they said. What army could possibly take it by force? It was absurd. Soldiers were kept on year after year, their farms falling into disrepair and their families falling into poverty despite whatever pay was coming from the treasury, all in the name of a siege that showed no promise of being brought to a successful conclusion. A great many were sympathetic to this view, and the will of the army began to waver. Into this depressed state came one of the great heroes of Roman history, Marcus Furius Camillus. Of patrician descent, Camillus had been elected military tribune 3 times over the course of the war, distinguishing himself on the battlefield and running a notoriously disciplined ship. The Senate and the people were both increasingly dissatisfied with the military leadership, who seemed more willing to fight amongst themselves than unite behind a winning strategy. So, sick of the inconclusive bickering, they turned to Camillus, whose record spoke for itself, and elected him to the first of his unprecedented 5 dictatorships. Later crises would keep the Romans coming back to him again and again, and it was the reputation he established for himself at Veii that kept them coming back. What looked like a never-ending siege would be brought to completion within his 6-month term of office. Camillus knew as well as anyone that a direct assault on the city was doomed to failure, so he set his mind on devising some other way to gain access. It did not take long for him to notice the Veiites' extensive sewer system and how easy it would be to breach the city from underneath. He set his army digging in shifts around the clock, making a tunnel from the Roman camp to one of the drainage pipes that ran under the city. He periodically ordered attacks on the walls to keep the Veiites busy, and they never caught on to the plan. It was now only a matter of time before the legions would come pouring in. Finally, the Romans reached the underground sewer system and followed it to the middle of the city. A raiding party was sent above, emerging from a temple and making straight away for the gates. Camillus ordered the bulk of his army in a frontal attack, which must have seemed like madness to the Veiites until the company of Romans appeared in their midst and opened the gates from within. The Romans did indeed come pouring in, and it was the end for Veii. Camillus and the Romans were not interested in terms of surrender or indemnities. They wanted to destroy Veii completely. The men were slaughtered and the women and children sold into slavery. The city was sacked and pillaged, with all its movable wealth finding a new home in the rucksack of some legionnaire. Prior to final victory, Camillus had made a fateful promise that 1/10 of the spoils of war would be dedicated to Apollo, but in the commotion of victory his promise was forgotten, and everything was piled into the baggage train undivided. The great Etruscan city of Veii had fallen, never to rise again. Upon returning to Rome, the victorious Camillus was awarded a well-earned triumph, though the procession would mark the beginning of his famous undoing, and would soon find him exiled from the city he had just led to victory. Riding at the head of his army, Camillus was pulled on his chariot by 4 white horses, traditionally an honor reserved only for kings. The inhabitants of the city whispered to one another that Camillus fancied himself a monarch, and began to look at him not as a conquering hero, but as a potential tyrant. His fate was sealed when, after the soldiers had returned home with their booty, Camillus began to worry about his unfulfilled promise to Apollo. Finally, he issued an order that all soldiers had to produce 1/10 of their treasure and hand it over to the state in order to appease the gods. The citizens were outraged, but complied out of their well-ingrained sense of religious obligation. They were further incensed when Camillus and the Senate announced that 1/10 of Veii's land would also be set aside for Apollo. The land-starved masses could not believe their ears, and it was really only a matter of time before they lashed out at their erstwhile hero. A year or two passed, and a tribune finally brought charges against Camillus for mishandling the wealth taken from Veii. Rather than face a hostile and humiliating trial, Camillus decided to leave the ungrateful Romans to their fate and went into voluntary exile. Legend has it that as he left, he offered a prayer that if he was innocent, that the gods should cause his former countrymen to regret his departure. A pure fabrication, but to the Romans, the sight of a massive barbarian invasion did indeed make them soon regret the absence of their best military commander. The victory over Veii marked a turning point for Roman history, as well as Italian history as a whole. Veii was one of the richest cities of Etruria, and its sack marked the beginning of the end of Etruscan dominance in northern Italy. In the north, Gauls from Central Europe began to cross en masse into the Po Valley, sweeping through Etruscan defenses and settling in Etruscan lands. The Etruscans thus found themselves squeezed between the Gallic migration and the Roman expansion. As I said earlier, military and political solidarity might have helped them beat off the attacks, but the independent-minded Etruscans kept to themselves and so saw their cities fall one by one. It would not be a quick decline. Indeed, we will find them continuing to fight Rome throughout the Samnite Wars, but they would never again have the power or prestige they had so recently enjoyed. In the end, they would all fall under Rome's yoke and find themselves servants where they had once been masters. Although the push from the Gauls helped precipitate Etruscan decline, it also prevented the end from coming too quickly. The Romans, flushed with victory, may well have continued to push north and defeat all the Etruscan cities one by one. However, a force of Gauls moved south through Etruria all the way to the gates of Rome, where they would decisively beat the Romans, handing them a defeat that would leave the city burned to the ground and its citizens debating not which Etruscan city they should attack next, but whether or not to abandon their ruined city completely. Next week, we will cover the sack of Rome and the return of Camillus, an event that would close a historical epoch, marking the end of the beginning for Rome. I would like to start this week with a correction. In the episode Decades of Gloom, I told the story of a wealthy grain merchant who attempted to usurp Republican control and install himself as king. The grain merchant in question was not named Manlius, as I mistakenly said, but rather Malleus. We are about to meet a patrician named Manlius, who will soon find himself embroiled in a conspiracy to overthrow the government.
but he bears no relation to the Malleus, who tried to use a grain famine to his personal advantage in 439 BC. I regret the error. I would also like to say that those of you who are noticing an improvement in audio quality are not hallucinating. I have recently upgraded my recording equipment. My only concern about this switch is that my previous efforts will now seem poor cousins in comparison to these new episodes. Please do not hold it against those episodes. It is not their fault. They were merely the victims of inferior equipment. The Romans were riding high after their decisive triumph over Veii. The defeat of their longtime Etruscan rival had left the Romans an economic powerhouse. They now controlled the lands north of the Tiber and began resettlement almost immediately. The crops from the rich Etruscan soil promised an end to the cycle of grain famines that had plagued Rome for the last 50 years. They also became the hub of commerce in central Italy and took sole possession of the all-important salt trade, exponentially increasing Roman wealth. Things were looking good for the Romans, but fate was about to deal them a cruel blow. In an instant they would crash down from the highest high to the lowest low and find themselves wandering aimlessly amidst the burned-out rubble of their city, wondering how the gods could have forsaken them so quickly and so completely. The barbarian sack of Rome would be one of the most traumatizing events in Roman history, and leave the Romans in fearful awe of the Gauls until Julius Caesar finally exorcised their psychological demons 350 years later. Rome would survive, but just barely, and not without lasting damage. Now I say that the Gauls sacked Rome, but that is too broad a description. The label Gaul was a catch-all used by the Romans to describe numerous independent tribes who lived in and around the Alps. There was no sense of union between the Gallic tribes themselves, apart from occasional alliances, and for the most part they fought as much amongst themselves as they did against any foreign race. The particular tribe that sacked Rome was called the Senons, and they were led by a strong warrior chieftain named Brennus. They had come over the Alps into the Po Valley in the previous century and settled along the Adriatic coast. This brought them into conflict with the Etruscans, who had previously controlled the land, and it was this conflict that brought the Senons into conflict with Rome. There is an official legend that explains Brennus's decision to leave the Adriatic and move south to attack Rome, as well as a modern interpretation that puts the attack in a wider geopolitical context of Italian realpolitik. The official legend is that Brennus attacked the Etruscan city of Clusium, who sent envoys to Rome desperately seeking assistance. The Romans were no great friend to Clusium, who had backed the hated King Tarquin in his bid to regain the throne 100 years before, but the Romans knew the Gauls were an enemy to be wary of, and so sent envoys to Clusium to take stock of the situation and report back how deeply Rome should involve itself. When they arrived, however, the Roman envoys immediately recognized the horde of barbarians as a real threat to all Italy, and agreed to help Clusium right then and there. These envoys wound up leading Clusium's army against the Gauls, and in the fighting a Gallic chieftain was killed. Brennus took offense to this. He felt that the diplomatic nature of their mission precluded the envoys from taking part in hostilities. He sent his own envoys to Rome to demand retribution, but the Romans, in their infinite wisdom, decided that rather than handing the envoys over to Brennus, would elect them military tribunes for that year instead. At this further insult, Brennus ordered his people to march south, where he would teach the ill-mannered Romans a lesson. Modern historians doubt that such a minor incident would lead Brennus to suddenly move his tribe south and attack one of the most heavily fortified cities in Italy. They postulate, and there is some evidence to back it up, that Brennus had come to an agreement with Dionysius of Syracuse to tie the Romans up while Syracuse made their move to dominate Sicily. The Romans had historically been the allies of a Sicilian city called Messana, and Dionysius would have been eager to prevent Rome from sending troops in support of a city that he was trying to capture. Thus an arrangement was made between Syracuse and the Gauls to attack Rome and keep them occupied while Dionysius made his move. This seems plausible, but we will never know for sure exactly why Brennus suddenly decided to march on Rome. We are not only unsure of why the Gauls attacked, but also when the attack actually took place. The confusion, again, is caused by the scarcity of accurate records prior to the event. Traditional Roman history records that the sack took place in 390 BC, though that date is derived from the often incomplete magisterial election rolls that later Romans used to calculate dates of past events. We will encounter this problem again when Livy makes the implausible claim that between 375 and 370 BC, no magistrates of any kind were elected. Livy explains this as being the result of a patrician-plebe political deadlock, but most likely he was just trying to reconcile what the electoral roll said with what his own backwards chronology was telling him. Modern historians, cross-referencing with the more accurate Greek records, place the sack of Rome in 387 or 386 BC. So we are not entirely sure why the Gauls marched on Rome, nor entirely sure when they did so. But we do know who marched, the Senons, and we know where they marched, from the Adriatic coast to Rome, and we know how they got there, they walked, and we know what happened when they got there, they sacked Rome. And 4 out of 6 is not bad when you're talking about things that happened 2,500 years ago. The Romans were aware of the Gallic advance and enlisted one of the largest armies they had ever assembled to battle a single enemy, with plausible estimates ranging from anywhere from 12 to 25,000 men. They gathered at the Allia River, actually more of a brook than a river, and waited for the barbarians to appear on the horizon. When they did, the Romans were immediately on the fearful defensive. The Gauls were like nothing they had ever seen before. Huge and painted, bearded, with long hair, roaring all manner of crazy battle cries, the Gauls were a fearsome sight, and when they charged full speed directly at the Roman line, it did not take long before the Romans broke. The wings of the Roman army, composed of the lightly armed lower-class soldiers, were easily routed and fled for home, leaving the heavily armed center phalanx to be surrounded and massacred. It was the worst defeat the Romans had suffered at this point in their history, but their nightmare was only just beginning. In their haste to save themselves, the fleeing soldiers made directly for the fortified Capitol Hill citadel, leaving the walls of the city unguarded and the gates wide open. The remaining inhabitants of the city either fled outright or followed the soldiers into the citadel, giving free range of the city to the pursuing Gauls, who, incredulous at the lack of resistance and believing it to be some sort of trap, actually waited a full day before they were satisfied it was no trick and entered the city. An initial attempt to take the capital failed, so Brennus, rather than waste his manpower in pointless fighting, decided to settle in and starve the Romans out, meanwhile stripping the city of all its movable wealth. The siege of the capital began to be measured not in days or weeks, but in months, without any sign of the deadlock breaking. The besieged Romans grew more and more desperate as their supplies and morale ran out. The Gauls were faring no better. The hot Italian summer was not what the northern tribesmen were used to, and they began to drop like flies. Disease ran rampant, and Brennus saw his force dwindle daily in the foreign climate. It was a race to the bottom as both sides hoped to hold out one day longer than their equally beleaguered foe. At one point the Romans were nearly defeated, but were saved at the last minute in dramatic fashion. A messenger had been sent from the capital to make contact with Camillus, their exiled hero, to plead with him to bring a force to lift the siege and save his former countrymen. The messenger scaled down an unguarded cliff, but the Gauls noticed the route and themselves attempted to scale the same cliff and break into the citadel. But famously, as they climbed, the sacred Capitoline geese, who the Romans had brought with them into the citadel, were roused and began to make a racket. The Romans, led by a patrician soldier named Manlius, were tipped off to the danger and drove the barbarians off the wall, preventing the only real attempt to take the Romans by force. Manlius, for his quick action and bravery, was lauded as a hero, but in a few years he would be executed for treason not far from the site of these heroics, a tragic victim of his own vanity. The siege stretched to 7 months, and both sides were at the breaking point. In their respective desperate straits, they both agreed to something neither would have considered at the start. The Romans would pay the Gauls to leave the city. Both considered this a dishonorable end to the fight, but the Romans had to get off the Capitol Hill, or they would all die, and Brennus, who wanted nothing more than to get out of the hot, diseased city, was now able to do so and still claim victory. The Romans agreed to pay the Gauls 1,000 pounds of gold, and scales were brought in to measure the amount. As the gold was being weighed, however, the Romans noticed that the scales had been tampered with, and the pounds were much heavier than they should have been. They complained, and in response Brennus threw his sword onto the scales, further increasing the imbalance, and stating famously, "Woe to the conquered." The Romans stifled their objections and measured out the remaining gold, fuming but unable to do anything. The story of the sack of Rome, in reality, probably ended here, with the Gauls withdrawing north after being paid off. However, later Romans spread a thick coat of triumphant propaganda over the end of the story to save themselves the embarrassment of admitting to such a dishonorable conclusion, just as they added the story of Mucius Scaevola to the end of the war with Clusium to avoid admitting that they had been beaten by Lars Porsena. In the Roman Hollywood ending, Camillus is reached and raises a force from the neighboring Latin tribes and marches on the city. He arrives just after the Gauls have been paid and, finding them sleeping off their triumph, attacks and beats the formerly invincible barbarian army, driving them out of Latium for good and recovering the Roman gold. Camillus then basks in the glow of Roman adulation as the screen fades to black and the credits roll. A nice story, but complete fiction. Regardless of whether Roman honor was saved at the last moment by miraculous intervention or not, the fact remained that the city was in ruins. At some point during the siege, a fire had started, and the city was gutted by an uncontrolled blaze. The surviving Romans, penniless and faced with the prospect of completely rebuilding their city, despaired that it was even possible, and began to speak of abandoning the Seven Hills altogether and moving en masse to Veii, where they could start afresh. Camillus strongly opposed this idea and gave an impassioned speech for the people to rebuild Rome and not flee in the face of adversity. To leave would be an admission of weakness and a moral failing. To stay would prove that Rome could never be defeated. The people, facing a choice between practical logistics and theoretical duty, remained unconvinced. But as the Senate was proceeding with the debate, a company of soldiers returning from guard duty stopped in the forum, and their commander ordered a halt, saying, "Well, we may as well stop here." The senators overheard this and, never ones to ignore a clear omen, immediately closed the debate and rejected all further proposals to abandon the city. Rebuilding would begin at once, no matter the cost or difficulty. Rome was here to stay. The history of Rome is bookended by barbarian sacks. It would be 850 years before another foreign invader stepped foot in the city. By then, Rome had risen, crested, declined, and was in the process of failing. Brennus' sack of Rome, on the other end, ushered in Rome's era of dominance. Until the sack, Rome was merely one among many in Italian politics, fighting and winning, but also dealing with setbacks and defeats. After the destruction of Rome, the Romans were reborn along with the physical city they lived in. It would be a more determined, more consciously imperial citizen body that would emerge in the 300s BC. The Romans would never again find themselves under the yoke of a foreign power, nor their walls breached by an invading force. When, in the 400s AD, the Visigoths and then the Vandals finally sacked the city, the level of despair was grossly inflated because the inviolability of the city had been taken for granted. Other cities changed hands, were occupied, or expelled occupiers. This was the natural ebb and flow of ancient politics. But Rome itself would be eternally free, granted special status by the gods. The Vandal sack, for all the physical damage it did, destroyed Rome psychologically, a blow from which it never recovered. And this sense of invincibility was born in the aftermath of the last barbarian sack, 850 years earlier. The Gallic victory humiliated, offended, and horrified the Romans who endured it, and they vowed to never let it happen again. They successfully kept their word for almost 1,000 years, a remarkable feat in the perilous and violent world of antiquity. Roman obstinacy, steadfast endurance, and unflinching resolve. A commitment to existence born out of near total destruction. From a practical standpoint, the sack also brings to an end the period of early Roman history about which we have no clear records or primary sources. Though all the previous records were lost in the fire, the Romans simply started again, leaving us a wealth of documentation that puts our understanding of their history on much firmer footing from this point on. I am thankful to say that the legend of Rome has finally ended, and the history of Rome has begun. Next week, the Romans begin the slow process of rebuilding. Their task was complicated by the fact that all their enemies, past and present, would attempt to take advantage of their weakened state. The Volscians and Aequians, of course, attacked, as always, but Latin allies revolted as well, and even some of Rome's own colonies decided the time was ripe to throw off the yoke of their mother city. But Camillus, not called the second founder of Rome for nothing, would lead the Romans to triumph and restore them on their inevitable path to glory. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. At the opening of the 6th book of his monumental History of Rome since its foundation, Livy wrote, "The history of the Romans from the foundation of the city to its capture, first under kings, then under consuls and dictators, decemviri and consular tribune, wars abroad and dissensions at home, I have set out in 5 books, covering matters which were obscure, both through their great antiquity, like objects dimly perceived in the far distance, and because in those days there were few written records, the only reliable means of preserving a memory of past events. A further reason was the loss of most of such accounts as were preserved in the commentaries of the pontiffs and other public and private records when the city was destroyed by fire. From now on, a clearer and more reliable account can be given of the city's civil and military history, after it made a second start, reborn as it were from its old roots with increased vigor and productivity." That seems like a good place to start this week. Rome was devastated. The city was in ruins, and the population, what remained of it anyway, despaired. Officially, the subject of abandoning Rome had been closed, but unofficially, the idea was still a potent force. Why rebuild when perfectly good homes sat vacant in a well-positioned, defensible city? The Romans had been merciless in their annihilation of the Veii, and the Etruscan city was practically a ghost town. But the Senate's mind was made up, and the Romans were ordered to rebuild, each according to their means. Camillus, whom the people now looked upon as twice their savior, if we believe the legends, stood firm behind staying in Rome, and the population, some reluctantly, followed their hero's lead. The new Rome that would grow out of the ashes of the Gallic Sack would be recognizable today, with its haphazard streets and deep tangled neighborhoods clearly devoid of any central planning. There was in fact no planning whatsoever. The Romans simply picked up what material they could salvage and began rebuilding wherever the whims of each individual directed. Rome, and I say this with love, is, and has been since the 380s BC, a convoluted mess that defies logic. The irony being that in almost every other town, city, or camp built by the Romans, rational right angles was the norm. A model was developed for the fortified military camp that centered around bisecting perpendicular roads that was copied in almost every other settlement the Romans established. A centurion encamped in Britain would have been able to easily navigate his way around a camp in Syria. Everywhere the Romans went, they took their standard grid city layout with them. But the Eternal City itself was the dark city of this Roman Type A OCD. And the roots of that chaos lay in the years after the Gallic Sack, when the Romans rebuilt quickly, but without any kind of master plan. Not that this is necessarily the Romans' fault. As they were attempting to rebuild their shattered city, nearly every one of their formerly subdued enemies took their shot at setting themselves free of the Roman hegemony. As I mentioned at the end of last week, the usual suspects, particularly the Volscians, reappeared, but longtime allies now rose up as well. Piling it on Rome became the fad du jour among long disgruntled Latin communities, who never got over Rome's breaking up of the Latin League 100 years earlier at the Battle of Lake Regillus. Even colonies set up by Rome with strong ties to the city joined in the rebellions and kicked their mother city while she was down. While trying to put their lives back together, the Romans kept being recalled to arms, now to fight on this front, now to fight that enemy, now to fight this former friend. It is no wonder the city grew so haphazardly. There was barely enough time to nail down the roof before it was time to go and fight again. Throughout these years, Camillus was the rock behind which the insecure Romans hid. In times of danger, they turned to him again and again to lead them to victory. Whether he was appointed official dictator, as he was in 389, 368, and for the fifth and final time, 367 BC, or whether he was elected as one of the military tribunes for that year, Camillus was unquestionably the leader of Rome. Everyone relied upon his strategic and tactical brilliance to see them through these dark times. His enemies, and he did have a few, accused him of arrogance, of treating his fellow tribunes as if they were his vassals, not his equals. But the people were indifferent to these accusations. Camillus was their man. Plus, the other commanders did little to inspire the people's confidence. At one point, a tribune leading a legion against an allied army of Latins and Volscians saw his army flee in terror and hide behind their camp walls. Camillus was ordered to take command, and, by his very presence, instilled the soldiers with enough confidence to march back out and defeat the enemy they thought so powerful. Camillus dominated his time, and it would be another 150 years until anyone emerged to equal him in the pantheon of Roman heroes. That man, Scipio Africanus, who delivered the Romans from the scourge of Hannibal, is often mentioned in the same breath as Camillus, and indeed, the consensus opinion is that later historians, Plutarch and Livy especially, colored their descriptions of Camillus to make him seem a prelude to the great Scipio of Africa. But as Camillus remained in the people's high esteem, another hero fell from grace. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the last name attached in honor of his bravery during the Gallic siege, would soon find himself etched into Roman history not as a great hero, but as a villain. After the withdrawal of the Gauls, Manlius's ego was severely bruised by the honors heaped upon Camillus, and he took them as a personal insult. Had he and the others not held out against the Gauls, Camillus never would have had the opportunity to save them. Surely that deserves some glory, but Camillus hogged it all. Manlius was one of the few amongst the citizen body who could not stand the sight of Camillus, who he considered to be a pompous fraud. This aggravation led Manlius to break ranks with his fellow patricians and take up the cause of the plebes. By making himself their champion, Manlius hoped to do an end run around Camillus and earn the acclaim he felt he deserved. The most pressing issue of the day was debt relief. Obviously, as the Romans rebuilt, there was a hefty amount of borrowing going on, and the interest payments began to bankrupt the population. Every day saw men hauled off to prison for defaulting on loans. Men who had fought at Veii and stood firm against the Gauls were daily being made slaves by moneylenders who showed no mercy or compassion. Manlius spoke out publicly in favor of relief and often paid the debts of former soldiers out of his own pocket and offered interest-free loans to any who asked. The patricians were disturbed by Manlius's new image as the savior of the people, not only because they saw him as letting irresponsible debtors off the hook, but also because he constantly slipped in references to the great untapped strength of the populace and how their numerical superiority ought to count for something in the formation of policy. The patricians saw these as veiled and not so veiled threats against the established order, and began to see Manlius as a revolutionary figure. Manlius was arrested once on charges of bringing false claims of theft against the moneylenders, but public outcry was so great that they were forced to release him. With peace abroad to allow for real public unrest, riots began to break out between patrician and plebe factions, Manlius offering daily harangues against the tyranny of the nobles, and offering himself as the only patrician who cared about his fellow citizens. The implication was clear: throw out the Senate and elect a new democratic government with me as your leader. Finally, unable to take it anymore, the patricians again arrested Manlius, this time on charges of sedition and treason. The trial of Manlius would become famous for the way it would play out. The trial was originally held on the Campus Martius, which lay in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill. During his defense, Manlius was able to stretch his hand up to the hill and remind the people of his great service to the city, asking how anyone could possibly believe he was now engaged in treason. The argument was having its effect, so the savvy patricians adjourned the trial to a different location. Now, without the Capitoline as a backdrop, the charges and evidence against Manlius stood on their own merits. Public opinion turned against Manlius, who, it became obvious, was engaged in an active conspiracy to overthrow the Senate. The verdict was swift and harsh. He was to be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a steep cliff on the Capitoline Hill used for executions, ironically dying in disgrace a few feet from where he had achieved his greatest glory. The death of Manlius did nothing to end plebeian unrest, however. Manlius saw an opportunity and exploited it. He did not create the conditions for that opportunity. The plebes' overriding concern at this point were, as we have seen, debt relief, but the old standbys of land redistribution and access to political power rose again. The former problem was wrapped up in the latter two, and the plebes began to focus their energy on the land and power questions. Both the land taken from Veii in the north and the land taken from the Volscians in the south conspicuously wound up in the hands of a few patrician landowners rather than being divided up amongst the masses. How were the people supposed to pay off their debts when they were denied the income land provided? Further, how was it that state policy had granted so much to so few? Obviously, whatever concessions had been made to the plebes in the past had lost their potency. The plebes finally saw the office of military tribune with consular power for what it was, an attempt to water down plebe authority and deny them access to the consulship, the ultimate office of state. One man in particular, a patrician with 2 daughters, took it upon himself to end once and for all this unbalance. Marcus Fabius Ambustus, a patrician who enjoyed plebe support, had married his eldest daughter to an influential patrician and his youngest to a wealthy plebe named Gaius Licinius Polo. The younger daughter complained that she would never receive the honors her elder sister received on account of her husband's plebe status. Fabius, the story goes, promised his daughter she would have everything her sister had and began working with his son-in-law Licinius to break the patrician stranglehold on the consulship. They began by pointing out to people that despite plebe access to the office of military tribune, no plebe had been elected to said office for the last decade, which was true. They then demanded a permanent return to the dual consulship, with the stipulation that one of the consuls had to be a plebe. Licinius got himself elected tribune of the plebes, an office that had fallen into some disrepute, and used his veto power to bring government business to a standstill. He promised to veto everything in sight, including the yearly elections, until his demands were met. In addition to access to the consulship, Licinius also demanded that a cap be put on the total amount of land a man could own, as well as regulations on interest rates. It was this shutdown, engineered by Fabius and Licinius, that Livy uses to explain his chronological gap, stating that between 375 and 370 BC, no magisterial elections were held. Though the duration and excess of the standoff is no doubt exaggerated, the outcome is not. The plebes finally gained access to the consulship. The moment would not come without a final appearance of the great Camillus, however. The civil unrest and power vacuum led to calls for a dictator, and the Senate named Camillus, who enjoyed the support of everyone, patrician and plebe alike. They were hoping Camillus would see things their way, but much to their discomfort, he did not. Now, due to a flaw in the appointment ceremony, a religious event stuffed full with every kind of Roman superstition, Camillus was forced to resign for that year, granting a reprieve of sorts to the clearly defensive patricians. The next year, though, 367 BC, Camillus was again named dictator for the 5th and final time. He used his power to broker the deal Licinius and his colleagues demanded, and for the first time a plebe would be elected consul. The crisis settled, Camillus resigned. The old Roman leader died soon after, the victim of a plague that decimated the Romans in the 360s BC. With his death, a new era dawned. The Romans had survived their brush with death and emerged a strong, more democratic place. The honor of first plebe consul historically goes to Lucius Sextius, one of Licinius's colleagues who had helped engineer the shutdown. The land ownership ceiling and regulation of debt were granted at the same time, and, ironically, Licinius himself would be prosecuted years later for violating his own laws after he sought to accumulate large tracts of land for himself and his family. At this point, the law stated merely that one of the consuls could be a plebe. Later, around 342 BC, a law would be passed stating that one of the consuls had to be a plebe. For now, though, the plebes accepted the obvious victory and passed to the next generation the task of not simply allowing equal access to power, but guaranteeing it. The veracity of this patrician-plebe showdown and the election of a first plebeian consul in 367 BC has been called into question by modern historians. In the first place, they point out that Roman historians of the late Republic and early imperial period were obviously drawing their narrative from more recent events, specifically the conflicts that centered around the Gracchi brothers, who used their veto power to try and force through land redistribution in the 130s and 120s BC. Second, modern analysis has determined that as many as a third of the consuls prior to 367 were in fact of plebeian origin. As is so often the case, a clear dramatic delineation in history is less plausible than a gradual shift in policy over the years. There is no doubt that the vast majority of early consuls were patricians, but it is suspected that this was not the result of overt discrimination, but rather because of the greater wealth and fame of patrician candidates. The 367 BC date is important, though, because from that point on there is a marked increase in plebe consuls, demonstrating some sort of conscious decision to grant plebeians more power. And of course, the existence of a 342 BC law stipulating that one of the consuls had to be a plebe is not disputed, and it seems likely that this was the culmination of a decades-long shift rather than a bolt out of the blue. In general, what can be stated is that after the sack of Rome, the plebes demanded and received far greater power than they had enjoyed prior to the arrival of the Gauls. The Romans struggled in the years after the Gauls left them for dead, but managed to hold on in the face of massive external pressure and internal dissension. The new enfranchisement of the plebes made the Romans a more cohesive and less divisive society. This cohesion would be tested by a confrontation that loomed on the horizon. Though the Romans did not know it yet, they were about to begin a series of war that would leave them the dominant force not just in Latium or central Italy, but in the entire peninsula. Next week, we will introduce the Samnites, the fiercest of all the hill tribes, who would not only prove more than a match for Rome, but also force the Romans to rethink everything they knew about warfare. The Romans would fight a single great war, with 3 distinct phases against the Samnites between 343 and 295 BC. The Samnite Wars would pull all the major powers of Italy onto one side or the other and culminate with the largest battle ever fought on Italian soil. When it was over, the Roman victory was so complete that it would be 200 years before an Italian people again mounted a serious threat to Roman rule, and, by that time, Rome had grown into a global empire the Italians were not trying to topple, but rather gain full legal citizenship within.